So let's move on to the next topic of discussion. Now, it's Black History Month, and because it's Black History Month, I'm doing something special this month. I was gonna start it on Monday, but like I said, I was under the weather, so I didn't get a chance to do it on Monday. But every live stream I do, Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 12 p.m., every live stream, I'm going to focus on a new or a different Black intellectual from the past, from Black history, from African American history. And the person that I wanted to start with today is an intellectual that really inspired me in many ways to look at the world completely different. There are very few people whose writings that I've read, even like when it comes to MLK, Martin Luther King, who I'm going to talk about in the next story, and Malcolm X. There are very few who I've read their writings, and I felt like my life changed after reading what they wrote. And their opinions opened me up to a whole new reality that I didn't even know was out there. That is the type of impact that W.E.B. Du Bois had on me. And I started really reading Du Bois. Of course, I heard about him like years ago, but I didn't start really reading a lot of his stuff until maybe about a couple years ago when I started Black and Intellectual. And Du Bois, like if you go on Black and Intellectual and you go back and you look at some of my oldest writings, involved Du Bois and Booker T. Washington and the rivalry they had with Marcus Garvey. And not so much Booker T. I don't believe he said much about Garvey, but Du Bois definitely had a lot to say about him. Because I want to say Booker T was dead before Garvey really exploded like that. But I like Du Bois for a number of reasons. Not just because he was a Black intellectual, obviously, Black intellectual, but because he had such a fulfilling life. He saw so much, and most importantly, Du Bois perfectly bridges two divides, especially divides that I see on the left. Usually on the left, you have two groups of people. And this might be an oversimplification, but a lot of people fall into two camps. You either have people who want to overemphasize race, and you have people who want to overemphasize class and economics. And what I've always maintained and what I've always believed is that the truth is somewhere in between. It's really more so. Hold on one second. Yeah, okay, here we go. It's really more so like a Venn diagram, okay, where in one circle you have race, in the other circle you have class. But the most important thing is how those two bubbles interact and coexist. And W.E.B. Du Bois, he wasn't the only intellectual who balanced both perfectly, but man, he really did it in ways that a lot of people, even today, a lot of people in the past and in the present, don't always do. And I believe, he had the perfect combination of everything. He could talk about race and he could talk about class. He could talk about the horrors of white supremacy. And he could talk about what he used to call industrial imperialism. And for those who don't know, Du Bois was a lot of things. He was a Pan-Africanist. You know, he spoke on the necessity for black people across the globe, across the diaspora, to become economically commingle. My nose is still a little stuffed up from my sickness, you know, but so I might be sniffing a little bit if you hear that in the microphone. That's what that is. But yeah, like, so I want to read a few things from Du Bois, because most of the time when it comes to Du Bois, most people know about two things. Alright, sorry about that. Most people know about two things. Most people know about man, my sinuses are acting up. Most people know about either his book that he wrote in 1903, which served in many ways as an autobiography, and it was called The Souls of Black Folk. And that was, like I said, that was written in 1903. And a lot of people also know about his theory called the Talented Tenth. And you can read the Talented Tenth online. It's available open source. It's one of his most well-known writings, right? And that was also written in 1903. Man, my nose is all kinds of messed up. Hold on. That was written in 1903 as well. But a lot of people don't know about his autobiography that he wrote in 1940. You see, because Du Bois lived such a long life, he died in 1960 in Accra, in Ghana. Woo! He died in 1960 in Accra, Ghana. But his writing spans so much more than the Talented Tenth and the Souls of Black Folk. If you guys really want to get in deep with a lot of the stuff that he wrote, I advise you to buy a book from the Library of Congress. It's over 1,000 pages long. It has 3 books that he wrote. The Suppression of the African Slave Trade, The Souls of Black Folk, which I mentioned a second ago, and Dusk of Dawn. That's the 1940 autobiography that is really underrated. A lot of people have not read it. I'm not sure if it's available online. It might be. And then it has a collection of his essays that he wrote for the Crisis. You see, he had his own publication, and he wrote about all sorts of things because, like I said, he lived such a fulfilling life, and there's so much that he saw. So, the last chapter of Dusk of Dawn, his 1940 book, with the last chapter is titled Revolution, and it touches on socialism and Marxism and how those two ideologies influenced his political thinking at the time, because not only was he a Pan-Africanist, but he was also a socialist. He was, putting a label onto him, I think, would be kind of difficult, because I think he had a number of very leftist economic leanings. But I want to read this passage to you. It's on page 761. And I can easily talk about Du Bois from the point of view of race and racism. But I want to talk about Du Bois from the point of view of class right now. And some of the things that he said about economics. Because that stuff is extremely important. And he had a lot to say that would shock some people. I wrote a whole article. I'll provide the link in the description box beneath this video. I wrote a whole article in 2016 entitled, where is it at? Let me pull it up. 8 W.E.B. Du Bois quotes that will blow your mind. Okay, I get a lot of traffic to this particular page Mostly because it ranks highly on Google, in the Google search engine. It ranks on the first page, so I get a lot of clicks from it. And I'm not going to go over every quotation because I wrote quotations. I write quotations in long form. I don't just write like, 3-sentence quotes and stuff like that, because a lot of times you don't really get the full breadth of what that particular person was actually saying. So I write in long form. But there's a couple quotes in particular that I want to read to you from this article that I wrote in 2016. But before I do that, I want to read this passage from Revolution, from the chapter Revolution in Dusk of Dawn. Check this out. It says, I think it was the Russian Revolution which first illuminated and made clear this change in my basic thought. It was not that I at any time conceived of Bolshevik Russia as ushering in any sort of, or any present millennium. So he's saying it's not that I saw Bolshevism as the be all end all. He says I was painfully sensitive to all of its failures, to all the difficulties which it faced. But the clear and basic thing which appeared to me in unquestioned brightness was that in the year 1917, and then after a struggle with the world and famine 10 years later, one of the largest nations of the world made up its mind frankly to face a set of problems which no nation was at the time willing to face, and which many nations, including our own, are unwilling fully to face even to this day. And what's important about, and this is me talking now, what's important about this whole quote is how pertinent a lot of this stuff that this dude was writing this 100 years ago. Well, actually, Dusk of Dawn was written in 1940, but he's talking about his sentiment from around like 1910, 1920. So like I said, that was like 100 years ago. So peep how pertinent a lot of this stuff still is today. And I'll continue. Those questions involve the problem of the poverty of the mass of men in an age when an abundance of goods and technical efficiency of work seem to be able to provide a sufficiency for all men, so that the mass of men could be fed and clothed and sheltered, live in health. He's talking in many ways about universal health care. That's how ahead of his time he was. And have intellectual faculties trained. Russia was trying to accomplish this by eventually putting into the hands of those people who do the world's work the power to guide and rule the state for the best welfare of the masses. It made the assumption, long disputed, that out of the downtrodden mass of people, ability and character sufficient to do this task effectively could and would be found. I believed this dictum passionately. So he said, like, all of this stuff that they were talking about in Russia, about the masses and universal health care and controlling the workforce and the labor force, he was like, I believed in all of that stuff passionately. It was in fact the foundation stone of my fight for black folk. It explained me. Okay, this is what Du Bois is saying in 1940 about his sentiment in 1910 and 1920. And here's the last chapter. I had been brought up with and this is the most important part, I had been brought up with the democratic idea that this general welfare was the object of democratic action in the state, of allowing the governed a voice in government. But through the crimson illusion of war, he's talking about the world wars, I realized, and afterward by travel around the world, saw even more clearly that so-called democracy today was allowing the mass of people to have only limited voice in government, that democratic control of what are at present the most important functions of men, work in earning a living and distributing goods and services, that here we did not have democracy. So he's saying in industry, in class within class, we don't have democracy. He says, continued, we have oligarchy, and oligarchy based on monopoly and income. And this oligarchy was as determined to deny democracy in industry as it had once been determined to deny democracy in legislation and choice of officials. Wow. That is potent. W.E.B. Du Bois was talking about oligarchy and plutocracy 100 years ago. We're talking about that stuff still to this day. This is how deep this man was. Du Bois was no joke. Like I consider him like, and I know he lived a long time ago, and a lot of his writings are dated. And even Du Bois, he lived so long that his views changed over time. Like, he wrote about stuff in he wrote about stuff in 1899 that when 1940 rolled around, he didn't have those same views anymore. But I mean, that's what you would expect when you live as long as somebody like he did. Okay, and when you have such a fulfilling life, and when you see as much as Du Bois saw, okay, you're gonna change your views eventually. So I have something else that I want to read to you. Something else that he wrote. And like I said, everybody, please check out this article on Black and Intellectual. 8 quote, like I'm gonna read the title to you. 8 W.E.B. Du Bois quotes that will blow your mind. And I say that for a reason, because they blew my mind. I'm like, why didn't I learn about this in elementary school? Why didn't I learn about this in high school? Hell, I didn't even learn about this in college. And I have a college degree. I took African American history. I even minored in history. My college minor degree was in history. Okay, and I didn't know about this stuff until because I taught myself. I didn't know about this stuff until after I left college, and that's kind of messed up. But hold on, where I have to find the quote specifically, because Du Bois wrote about a lot of stuff. He wrote about the unconstitutional acts against black people. Something that, if y'all hear me talk a lot about unconstitutional illegal acts against black people and unconstitutional illegal acts against black people, the reason why I talk about that so much is because I'm like channeling the soul or the spirit of Du Bois, not literally, but in concept and in theory. I'm channeling Du Bois because Du Bois wrote about the unconstitutional acts of lynching and things like that. He wrote about what he called the Tuskegee machine and controlled black opposition. Okay, he took one of the reasons why Du Bois and Booker T. Washington were beefing. One of the reasons why they really butted heads with each other, okay, is because Du Bois saw Booker T. Washington as a stooge. Now, you could debate that. I'm not saying Booker T. Washington didn't have any ideas that were not valid, but Booker T. Washington, he was more of the conservative of his time period in many ways. You know, he would go around advocating that black people shouldn't protest. This was during the age of lynching. Like black people were literally being hung from trees, and Booker T. Washington was going around saying black people shouldn't protest. And he said Du Bois had this whole thing where he didn't believe black people should seek higher education and go to college and get educated. And Du Bois completely, he didn't agree with that at all. because Du Bois, his whole thing was the talented 10th. So he thought, like, he saw education as a way for black people to advance themselves. But Du Bois also was one of the founders of the NAACP. A lot of people know that as well, but you know, so Du Bois wrote about controlled black opposition and about how Booker T. Washington was taking money from people like Andrew Carnegie and J.D. Rockefeller to spin a certain narrative in the black community, and they were buying up a lot of black-owned businesses, and they were buying up a lot of black-owned newspapers, and basically getting a lot of those black newspapers to not talk about some of the stuff that was going on at the time. It was real deep, okay, and Du Bois called that mess out. He talked about racial and economic oppression. He talked about, like I said earlier, industrial imperialism. He had a very powerful economic voice that should not be slept on. He was a beast in this regard. In many ways, Martin Luther King was a beast when it came to economics too, and a lot of people mention that. I was just talking about that not too long ago when MLK Day came around. But you know, Du Bois, like, and I wouldn't be surprised if King got a lot of his stuff from Du Bois, and that's actually true in many cases, because King was aware of Du Bois, you know, and so King got a lot of his stuff from W.E.B. Du Bois. King got a lot of his stuff from Garvey. A lot of people don't know that. So let me read this to you guys. This quote also comes from the chapter Revolution in his 1940 book Dusk of Dawn. And this is what W.E.B. Du Bois said about plutocracy. And for those who don't know, plutocracy is basically rule of... my voice is getting high-pitched for some reason. Plutocracy is ruled by the rich, and ruled by corporations, and ruled by industry. And so he was talking about plutocracy, he was talking about democratic socialism, and he was talking about what he called the basic American black creed. So he said, and I quote, "I stood, as it seemed to me, between two paths, diverging to extreme, like these are the two paths. Extreme communism on one end and violence on the other hand. And extreme reaction, or let me start over. I stood, as it seemed to me, between paths diverging to extreme communism and violence on the one hand, and extreme reaction to plutocracy on the other. I saw the disaster for American blacks, and following a set determination to ignore race hate, and nearing instead a creed of eventual violence and revolution. We had got to prepare ourselves for a reorganization of society, especially and fundamentally in industry. And for that reason, we had to work as a group toward the socialization of our own wealth and the establishment of such social objects in the nation and in the world." He said the socialization of black wealth, basically. And he had several bullet points. This is on page 774. Let me see. Okay, I can't find it in the book, but he had several bullet points, and I only have 3 listed here in the quotes. This is B. So the second bullet point. He says, "We repudiate all artificial and hate engineering deification of race separation as such, but just as sternly we repudiate an enervating philosophy if black escape into an artificially privileged white race which has long sought to enslave, exploit, and tyrannize over all mankind." So he's saying we repudiate the artificial nature of race separation. So he's basically talking about segregation. So he's saying we repudiate segregation, but we just as sternly repudiate any philosophy of black escape into some artificially privileged white racial hierarchy, which has long sought to enslave, exploit, and tyrannize over all mankind. So he's like, look, yeah, we don't like segregation, We're not segregationists. We're not advocating for that. But at the same time, we shouldn't be rushing to, jump and join them, and they're running around the world enslaving and exploiting and terrorizing and having, propping up these tyrannical regimes all over the world. So Du Bois, like decades before King even got around to saying it, because King, wasn't really born yet. And if he had been born, he was really young. But the same thing King said after integration, when he was like, I feel like what was the quote? I feel like I've integrated my people into a burning house, or something along those lines, where he was starting to realize that social integration without economic integration would create a scenario where black people would become overly dependent on these systems of exploitation and systems of oppression, in the black community. And that's exactly what's happened. Du Bois was saying the same thing back in the 30s and 40s. Du Bois was saying the same exact thing decades before King was saying that. He was saying, yeah, we repudiate separation of the races. We're not separatists. We don't advocate for segregation. But at the same time, we shouldn't be rushing to integrate with these questionable forces either. I just find that very interesting. Here's the next one. He said, we believe that the labor force and intelligence of 12 million people, he's talking about black people, the labor force and the intelligence of 12 million people is more than sufficient to supply their own wants and make their advancement secure. Therefore, we believe that if carefully and intelligently planned, a cooperative black industrial system in America can be established in the midst of and in conjunction with the surround national industrial organization, and in an intelligent accord with that reconstruction of the economic basis of the nation, which must sooner or later be accomplished. Wow. Like, if I had I need to get some audio some audio sounds to play, like flames and something like that, when something real good information like that gets played, because that's really powerful what he just said. Well, not just said, but what he said decades ago, advocating for black co-ops and black basically black industry. He's saying a cooperative black industrial system. So not just black businesses. We don't just need black businesses. We need black industry. We need a whole entire black industrial system. This is the stuff that Du Bois was talking about years ago. And then lastly, he said, we believe in the ultimate triumph of some form of socialism the world over. This is where, Du Bois's democratic socialism is coming out. He says that is common ownership and control of the means of production and equality of income. And so, like I said, that was, and those things, as well as some other things that I'm not even going to go over because it would take too long, that is what Du Bois called the basic American black creed. Okay, and yeah, so that was Du Bois. I was going to read what he wrote about industrial imperialism, but I'm going to leave that for you guys to read on the blog. Like I said, check out this article that I wrote way back. Where's the date at? August the 26th of 2016. Okay, so over a year ago. 8 W.E.B. Du Bois quotes that will blow your mind. You can honestly just type that into Google, or you can wait for me to post this video, or for this video to be posted on YouTube, and you can get the link that way. So yeah, that's why I wanted to bring up Du Bois. He's, I wanted to mention him first for Black History Month, because he's one of my favorite intellectuals. Arguably, he might be my favorite intellectual. Because as long ago as he lived, so much of what he wrote still bears fruit today.